Hello, welcome everyone, friends old and new, esteemed guests, and a warm welcome to those watching on live stream, because there are quite a few of those. As Warren and I have the pleasure tonight of introducing Richard Noble to the stage. A bit of a daunting task for him, I guess, in front of friends, of family and of peers. But an inaugural lecture is a night to celebrate the award of a professorship, the highest accolade a university can bestow. So it's a significant occasion. And it's a moment to reflect on an academic career and to share with all of us what the future might hold. Having stood here on many occasions before, I've grown to understand, albeit in my case dramatically second-hand, what it takes to reach this milestone. It's my job tonight to highlight how Richard came to become the academic he is today. Firstly, I'd like to say that as head of department of Goldsmiths Art, Richard has personified much of what I believe is best in that role. And I want to thank you personally, Richard, for wearing that task so very well and so elegantly. You've helped Goldsmiths not only to maintain our art reputation, but to propel our evolution during what has been a time of unprecedented and very often unwelcome change in our world. Richard is blessed with the stature and with the style of a great leader. He's with a clear and visionary eye for the future. It may surprise some that art at all, but politics, how at home you must feel here. His provincial home in Saskatchewan was and still is seen as a stronghold of Canadian social democracy. The province was the first in North America to elect a social democratic government back in 1944. This heritage, along with his very politically active father, guided him towards study at the University of British Columbia in UBC in Vancouver, where he earned his BA in political science. What followed after was a love affair, which we are glad still continues today. Because after being offered a scholarship at LSE, Richard moved to London, and the city made a lasting and poignant impression on him. In London, Richard enjoyed all the freedoms a big city offers, a challenging and fluid space so dramatically different from rural Canada. I think above all, the anonymity of the city draws all of us in, especially those of us from smaller, tighter communities. Richard told me, in London no one asks who you are, simply what you can do. That's not the way in other places, folks who've been here all your lives. Although Saskatchewan was many miles away, Richard says that he heard echoes of home when he first heard Tony Benn speak in the streets of London. London was new and exciting, a reimagining of its provincial political milieu in a very different place. After staying in the UK to complete his PhD at LSE, he returned to Canada, initially to work in the University of New Brunswick before obtaining an associate professor role at the University of Winnipeg. I always keep checking in case I'm getting some of this fundamental stuff wrong, which I'm very careful to do. He established himself in Winnipeg, and it was here that art became his academic focus. He began fueling and fusing his political theory through contemporary art, writing reviews and running events. He spent 10 years in Winnipeg, during which time he returned to London whilst on sabbatical, and it was on this trip in '96 he met his future wife. Ivana, are you there? You are. We are so indebted to you, Ivana, because that love bond kept him here, and that is so valuable to us. Eventually you moved to London permanently in 2000, and the newlyweds, 99, saw the birth of their daughter, Bella. Initially, there's a role model stuff here. He initially spent a year as a full-time dad, finding his feet as a parent, embarking on a second chapter in London, and relishing relishing a free new milieu academically. On returning to work, he became a consultant lecturer at the Sotheby's Institute of Art. This was his first formal role, teaching and working primarily in art. He held that role until his appointment at Goldsmiths in 2005. Richard's introduction to Goldsmiths is educative, instructive. It's proof that the unexpected and the unplanned occurrence in life is what kind of guides us to our triumphs. Because your original connection with Goldsmiths came through the nanny of your daughter, who was also the nanny of the daughter of Juan Cruz. Many of you will remember he worked here in the art department, and he's now Dean of Arts and Humanities in the Royal College of Art. Big cities, small villages, what's the difference? The two crossed paths, and Juan invited Richard to give a couple of guest lectures at the college. They were clearly highly impressive because many more invitations followed, as well as regular teaching opportunities. You joined the department, as I say, in 2005 on a permanent basis, and you've flourished here since. Your role as head of department has occupied 9 of your 13 years here. That is a unique statistic and one to be proud of. It's fair to say that your relatively newness and your coming from another place was helpful in a department that had more than its share of fractures and divisions back then. And all of that personal style, as well as the fresh approach, was hugely helpful and has continued to be that. For what it's worth, I feel that having an opportunity to lead the department, Richard has been able to fulfill within him a sense of belonging in place. In so doing, he has dramatically enhanced this place. The central theme of tonight's lecture is utopia, something in Richard's words which requires space, freedom, and aspiration. He further went on to say that at Goldsmiths, this freedom is nurtured. Here you are left to be who you want to be. I know this art gallery business has kept you very busy, Richard, but I thought a TEF narrative submission around Goldsmiths as utopia would be very well received. I'm sure so many here would subscribe to it. Academically, Richard has published widely on topics around utopianism, space, and sculpture, the latter of which has been largely done alongside Anthony Gorman. Richard is not just a talented and accomplished academic, but someone who has proved himself to be dedicated to the wider functions of the university. Here he has, of course, taken on countless administrative responsibilities, which has made him a respected figure, recognizable across all corners of the college. His influence with students, with colleagues, and the wider world of art, of course, is something of which Goldsmiths is duly proud to boast. And finally, and appropriately, this celebration comes just a day after yet another milestone regarding the CCA. Because Sarah and Richard helped us lead a remarkable group of major donors, local politicians, to the topping out ceremony of the space, which has something to do with putting the final steel girder in place, I believe. I didn't see that happen, but I saw some cutting. But we are this is a formative moment in the life of the CCA. So it's great that tonight is happening, almost as if it were planned in sequence with that. Because Richard, of course, has been a central component of the gallery's success. He has led and curated a project which will secure not only a wonderful asset for Goldsmiths, but for this whole community and for this city. His utopian vision is now made manifest. And dear God, there were many dystopian moments on the way, but that thing is about to be there, and it is a wonderful, wonderful achievement. This lecture tonight sounds like an absolute treat. I thank you all for being here, for your support for Richard, and your willingness to share this significant moment in the scholarly life. There will be a drinks reception afterward. It is our great tradition that there are no questions after an inaugural lecture at Goldsmiths. It's this, only one person gets to promenade and show off tonight. Not the rest of it. But there will be drinks and a chance to chat and challenge in the foyer afterwards, and to raise a celebratory glass to a great personal success story. without any further delay, it gives me huge pleasure to welcome Professor Richard Noble to us.
Thank you very much for that. I almost feel as though I should quit now while I'm ahead. I have some visual decoration to my talk, which, as you'll see, broadly speaking, relates to some of the themes I want to develop. So the title of it is The View from Nowhere, the Utopian Impulse in Art and Education. Art and education, as Pat indicated, have dominated my professional life at Goldsmiths College, which began in 2005 when I started in the art department as a part-time lecturer in critical studies. My academic background prior to joining Goldsmiths had primarily to do with political philosophy and only secondarily to do with researching and writing about contemporary art. So my research now attempts to combine elements of both, and as a result tends to fall through the cracks or yawning gaps that exist between these different disciplines. One of the reasons I love working at Goldsmiths, and I'm grateful to the art department, is that this kind of hybridity of interest is accepted here. We regard it as normal that artists, writers, academics should try to bring different modes of understanding and creativity together. It doesn't make us unique, but it does make us unusual in an increasingly instrumentalized and specialized academic world. Part of what I want to do today is explain how a very old concept in political theory, the concept of utopia, can be used to advance a different understanding of the value of both art and education from the one currently dominating the contemporary moment. I want to suggest that the utopian impulse underlying some art production can help us to understand the political significance of art in the contemporary world. And I want to suggest that the utopian ideals embedded in the curricula we offer at Goldsmiths might be used to develop a language to counter the assumptions and rhetoric of what Martha Nussbaum has called education for economic, the education for economic growth paradigm currently dominant within higher education. So the concept of utopia has a long and distinguished pedigree in the history of Western thought. The term came into usage as a consequence of Thomas More's text Utopia, published in 1516. Moore invented the word, a sort of pun derived from the Greek ou for no, topos for place, to name a fictive island in which human beings are said to live in a rational and harmonious society that contrasts sharply with medieval England, late medieval England. But the tradition goes back much further than Moore to Plato's Republic, written in the 5th century BCE, and continues into the modern period with Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, Tommaso Campanella's City of the Sun, Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Social Contract, as well as many 19th century writings, including those of Fourier, Owen, and Morris, to name just a few. Now, the classical utopians typically offer us a vision of a world alternative to their own, but at the same time based on it. In this sense, a utopian vision is always a projection, an attempt to reimagine the present in a way that overcomes the problems or contradictions inherent in it. These works look to the future or another condition from the standpoint of a problematic present reality, and so typically contain a programmatic element, a vision of how the world could be, and a diagnostic element, an analysis of the limitations of the present reflected in the vision of the ideal. Thus, Plato's Republic describes, as Socrates puts it, a just city in speech, a radical vision of the polis ruled by a class of philosopher kings in which the equality of men and women and the abolition of the family and the ruling class completes the three waves necessary to deliver the polis from its corrupt state. Plato knew his three waves, which shocked his anti-intellectual, deeply patriarchal contemporaries. He knew they would regard these three waves as impossible to put into practice. Yet at the same time, for Plato at least, the ideal of justice developed in the Republic constituted a deeper reality that could not be perceived from the standpoint of most human beings. It represented the true potential inherent in human association, and so a standard against which to judge the various imperfect forms such associations take. A more modern but similar text in the history of political thought is Rousseau's Social Contract, published in 1762. Rousseau offers the reader a radical vision of direct democracy, based broadly on an idealized account of the government of a rural Swiss canton. The central point of Rousseau's vision is that freedom requires being ruled by the general will, the unmediated, unrepresented will of the community for its own good. In Rousseau's view, all citizens must participate in the making of the law in order for the general will to become manifest. The citizen's right and duty to will the general will are identical and cannot be alienated. The citizen's freedom consists in their capacity to discern and will the general will and then live in obedience to it. Freedom in this sense means subjecting one's private interest to the law that expresses the general will. Now, Rousseau's vision of democracy is highly egalitarian and participatory. He believes that all citizens must participate equally in the making of law, and that to do so effectively they must be roughly equal to each other in the civil society. His reasons for thinking this are complex. It might be said to boil down to the argument that inequality promotes struggles for relative status between people, and so promotes faction and competition, which makes it impossible for citizens to subject their private personal interests to the general will. So for Rousseau, social and economic equality are a condition of freedom. Now, Rousseau's blueprint for a radical egalitarian democracy, taking, quote, taking men as they are and laws as they might be, unquote, as he puts it, provides not so much a guide for how to achieve democratic institutions as an analysis of how far most countries are from ever achieving them. It is in this sense a utopian theory. It is not primarily concerned with providing a blueprint for reforming existing institutions or explaining how it might be possible to bring such a set of institutional arrangements into being. Like Plato, Rousseau's concern is rather to hold up a kind of diagnostic looking glass to his contemporaries. He does so by providing a vision that is radically different from anything that actually exists, or indeed has existed. As an intellectual construct, it arrives from outside history, from nowhere, and provides a critical diagnostic tool that challenges us to think differently about democracy, freedom, and equality. And its intellectual and political significance, like Plato's Republic, lies not in its realization as a blueprint for a different society, not as a program, but rather as a tool for thinking critically about these issues. The classical utopians were primarily interested in developing diagnostic tools for understanding how societies might be organized justly. But in the 19th century, utopian thinking became decidedly more programmatic. The utopian socialists, I have in mind here Saint-Simon, Fourier, and Owen, all developed utopian visions aimed at overcoming what they regarded as the contradictions besetting their societies. Poverty, equality, repressive bourgeois conventions grounded in patriarchy and lack of education. But in addition to embodying these in their writings, each in slightly different ways, formed the strategy of building small utopian communities that would serve as a kind of bridge between capitalism and socialism. These communities were experimental and attempted to establish communal property, social equality, free education, abolition of the patriarchal family, sexual liberation, and with the general goal of creating communities in which human nature could achieve its potential. Now, the failure of these experiments, and many others in both Europe and America during the 19th century, led to the widespread pejorative meaning of the term utopia as an unrealizable ideal, something unrealistic and unachievable. Since the 19th century, in general parlance, on both left and right of the political spectrum, to call something utopian was to dismiss it as too idealistic, as an escapist fantasy. Now, Marx and Engels are, in a strong way, responsible for this. Marx and Engels make this point scathingly in relation to the utopian socialists. While they do concede that the utopian socialist plans were revolutionary in aspiration, they criticized their followers for quickly reifying into reactionary sects, more committed to the ideals of their founders than the revolutionary project of the proletariat. As they wrote in the Communist Manifesto, quote, "The utopian socialists still dream of the experimental realization of their social utopias, of founding isolated phalansteres, of establishing home colonies, of setting up little Icaria, duodecimo editions of the New Jerusalem. And to realize all these castles in the air, they are compelled to appeal to the feelings and purses of the bourgeoisie." So for Marx, the aspiration to building isolated utopian communities might have the virtue of instructing the proletariat in the principles of its historical task, just as it was beginning to discern this. But it could never be an actual political strategy, because it lacked the universal aspiration to revolutionary transformation. His and Engels' point is partly that these communities were always bourgeois projects, perpetrated by bourgeois intellectuals and paid for by their bourgeois sympathizers, well-meaning but idealistic and ultimately reactionary because their inevitable failure tended to reinforce the status quo ante. And this charge lingers against utopian strategies of all kinds today. Despite the widespread dissipation of any realistic expectation of proletarian revolution, to be utopian for many is to be woolly-headed or idealistic. But while Marx's critique of utopia remains hugely influential, it is also the case that philosophically, the concept of utopia was in an interesting way resuscitated in the mid-20th century, prior to the mid-20th century, by the Marxist philosopher Ernst Bloch. Bloch's views on utopia are complex and so difficult to summarize, but they are, I think, important for understanding the critical potential of the concept of utopia in both art and education. In Bloch's view, the utopian impulse is immanent in all future-oriented activity. To be utopian for Bloch just is what it means to engage with one's political and social reality, which at any given moment in time is necessarily both what we can observe and know about that reality, and the hopes and aspirations we form through our experience and interpretation of it. This is to say that much of our experience of social reality involves a dynamic relation between our understanding of what that reality is and our imaginative sense of what it might be. The two things follow from this for Bloch. One is that utopia is immanent in our experience of reality. It is, as it were, part of what it means for a self-conscious being with a sense of itself existing over time to experience the world. The second is that virtually all future-oriented activity, from daydreams to planning holidays to writing constitutional proposals, insofar as it aspires to a better condition than the present, is in some sense utopian. Bloch refers to this as the not yet, a sort of indeterminate potential that exists within both consciousness and the material world in the process of becoming. Bloch thought of the material world as being in a process of becoming, and he thought of consciousness as capable of providing the imaginative, future-oriented form through which that process could be made determinate. There was nothing preordained about this process of becoming. All imagined future possibilities are in principle open, but not all will or can be realized. At the same time, he is not committed to a pure voluntarism. The not yet conscious strivings of individuals are not guaranteed to give shape to the world's becoming, but without them, that becoming remains indeterminate. Now, as an ontology, it owes much to Hegel, clearly. As Ruth Levitas put it, utopia, as the expression of a not yet conscious, is vindicated insofar as it reaches forward to the real possibility of the not yet become. It is thus actively bound up in the process of the world's becoming as an anticipation of the future rather than merely a compensation or escapist fantasy in the present, and through its human purpose and action as a catalyst for the future, unquote. This gives the utopian impulse a central role in the constitution of reality, but it also creates some serious problems. If virtually all future-oriented activity is utopian, we require a way of distinguishing between the trivial and the substantial, the good and the bad utopian activity. Otherwise, as Adorno pointed out, quote, there is just nothing between heaven and earth that can, just as there is nothing between heaven and earth that cannot be seized upon psychoanalytically as something sexual, so there is nothing that cannot be used as symbolic intention, nothing that cannot be suitable for a Blockian trace, and thus everything becomes nothing. The critical normative significance of utopia is clearly diminished if any and all future activity or thought can be utopian. However, for Bloch, the ubiquity of the utopian impulse just derives from how we exist in the world. He did not regard all utopian activity as equally likely to give shape to the future. On the contrary, Bloch analyzed and judged the significance of utopian activity in terms of historical materialism and a more or less consistent belief that Marx had identified the outlines of the future communist world in the radical injustice of the capitalist present. On this basis, he distinguished between abstract and concrete utopian forms. Abstract utopias are utopian strategies that fail to anticipate or embody the future implications of proletarian revolution. As such, they are a kind of wishful thinking, unaccompanied by the will to change anything, and therefore escapist and compensatory. They fail comprehensively either to anticipate or influence the future. Planning a holiday, imagining another career, building a utopian socialist community would all be examples. Concrete utopia, on the other hand, points to a real future. It both anticipates the future and helps to bring it into being. It does so because it is grounded, in Bloch's view, in objective tendencies, as these are defined by historical materialism and Marxian theory more generally. Thus, for Bloch, the entire Western intellectual tradition, intellectual and cultural tradition, was a living source of utopian prefiguration. Some utopian forms attaining to a concrete aspiration of objective historical tendencies. Others, while possibly embodying a kind of creative or intellectual genius, remain abstract, compensatory rather than anticipatory, because they are ultimately unrelated to the revolutionary future. So while abstract utopia may express desire, only concrete utopia carries hope in the Blockian sense. Now, this is an invigorating and in many respects deeply subtle account of the role of the utopian impulse in human life, one that validates art as a substantive mode of understanding that contributes significantly to the constitution of the social world. Imagining a better world is said to be a necessary part of how that world comes to be. Nevertheless, for reasons widely rehearsed, Bloch's account of utopia is deeply problematic, insofar as it hangs on the possibility of proletarian revolution, as this is outlined in Marx's theory of historical materialism. Bloch's theory of utopia is focused on the programmatic content or potential of human activity. The issue for him seems to be whether or not the political program, the work of art, the philosophical text participate in the anticipatory wishful thinking, the educated hope that is necessary to the realization of the coming utopian world. None, save perhaps Marx, is able to outline the full complexity of what is required to achieve the new world. But all are judged in terms of whether they embody objective tendencies identified by Marx or those who claim to interpret them authoritatively. In the end, despite being a powerful and rich vindication of the validity of the utopian impulse in human life, it begins to look a lot like teleology, the Western cultural and philosophical tradition read retrospectively as culminating in proletarian revolution and the realization of communism. Now, I would argue that from our current standpoint, Bloch's utopian ontology is useful for thinking about the significance of art and education in the unfolding social world. Much contemporary art is utopian in the sense outlined by Bloch. It interprets the world by reimagining it as possibility. Art can be understood as a conscious and indeed unconscious engagement with the material world in order to transform it. And as such, both the activity of making art as well as the products of that activity can be understood as utopian. In this sense, all art, all creative activity is utopian. But of course, not all of this activity has aesthetic or political significance, and so the capability to influence the unfolding world. Understanding the significance of art in relation to the social world is perhaps harder now than it was in the first half of the 20th century when Bloch was writing. As I noted, the objective framework that Bloch adhered to for distinguishing between concrete and abstract utopian activity, which the latter, which is compensatory and so at best reconciles us to the present, was the theory of historical materialism and its promise of universal revolution. This evaluative framework is no longer open to us because the promise of revolution has receded, has become itself abstractly utopian in Bloch's sense, in both politics and art. But the avant-garde movements of the 20th century were either allied to revolutionary political movements or understood themselves to be revolutionary in relation to other forms of art and culture. Malevich, Tatlin, Elizitsky in Russia, Dada, Cubism, Surrealism in France, Futurism in Italy, all sought to make art that prefigured the coming revolutionary world, in part to bring that world into being. They represented the attempt, at any rate, to achieve what Bloch termed concrete utopianism. Whereas equally innovative and brilliant artists, such as Mondrian or Matisse or Brancusi, would represent for Bloch an abstract utopianism. Although formally brilliant and capable of genius, they were too narrowly aesthetic in their innovations to properly anticipate the coming world, and so could only have compensatory significance. Now, my sense is that in contemporary Europe and North America, the political significance of utopian art now has more to do with its diagnostic potential, and more significantly with the values it embodies as an activity, than our ability to read in it, in its programmatic content, any concrete or objective prefiguration of the future. Nonetheless, the impulse to evaluate art forms in terms of a presumed objective future remains with us. There is a common tendency amongst critics of art to describe artworks as conservative or radical. Sometimes this means formally conservative, as in not pushing back the boundaries of formal innovation, or somehow harking back to a now defunct set of formal strategies, charged sometimes leveled against figurative painting or sculpture, for instance. But more often the charge of conservatism or radicalism is meant politically. A work is labeled conservative because it somehow fails to embody a critique of its own conditions of production and reception, or it is too easily reduced to a type of commodity. It flatters its audience by being too accessible, or fails somehow to imply or enunciate a critique of the neoliberal consensus. This kind of criticism enacts Bloch's distinction between abstract and concrete utopias. It presupposes a conception of a better, more just future against which the political significance of the artwork is judged. There is, of course, nothing in principle wrong with such judgments, but they do beg the question of what precisely the conception of a better future one presupposes in judging an artwork conservative or radical. What precisely is the conception of a better future one presupposes in judging an artwork conservative or radical? In a world in which the truth of historical materialism no longer holds, what is the future world that underlies the division of artworks into categories such as radical and conservative? Well, I believe we need to look elsewhere for the answers to this question and for the political significance of utopian art. One such place is the older diagnostic tradition of utopian thinking in political theory and literature. The great utopian works of philosophy and literature retain an ambiguity between their programmatic and their diagnostic dimensions. They sustain a productive tension between the way the world might be and the way the world is. And the substantive political element is the diagnostic or critical potential inherent in that tension. This is one of the reasons artists are drawn to utopian strategies, I believe. They involve modeling, the construction of imaginary and often radically other alternatives to the existing state of things. These constructions both reflect the historical and cultural specificities of the context in which they are devised and make a claim to be trans-historical, somehow outside the aesthetic and political specificities that give rise to them. It is this character of being outside or trans-historical that allows the diagnostic element of such works to gain purchase. The view from nowhere works like a diagnostic mirror in which we can read a critique of our existing arrangements. The programmatic element is essential because it constitutes the substance of the utopian modeling in art or philosophy or literature, but no one should confuse it, as many have, with a pragmatic solution to the world problems. In other writings, I've tried to identify a number of different utopian strategies adopted by contemporary artists. It's perhaps worth reiterating that although I take the very activity of making art to be utopian, not all artists employ utopian strategies or make what I would term utopian art. Nonetheless, there are a variety of strategies in contemporary art that might be termed utopian. What links them is not so much a common subject matter or media, but rather the formal strategy of modeling possible worlds or situations, and in doing so creating a tension between an imminent critique of the present and an imagined future implied by that critique. As Bloch expressed it, utopian consciousness wants to look far into the distance, but ultimately only in order to penetrate the darkness so near it of the just-lived moment, in which everything that is both drives and is hidden from itself. Quote. I'd like to mention two kinds of utopian strategy that I think are active in the current moment amongst artists. Both represent clusters of practices that, in different ways, draw upon the legacy of the avant-garde. The first, which I term critical utopian strategies, include artists as diverse as Thomas Hirschhorn, Joop van Lieshout, Art Titchener, and Goshka Maskuga. Broadly speaking, these relate to one question: how does one imagine or possibly affect radical social change when all departures from liberal capitalist norms are regarded as forms of dream life? Hirschhorn's uncompromising installations express his commitment to making art politically, to challenge his viewers to engage actively with his critique of contemporary life. Van Lieshout's darker, even more dystopic utopians, in the Slave City Project, for instance, draws out implications of our future social arrangements in stark and disturbing ways. Whereas one might argue that Maskuga and Titchener want to revisit utopian or revolutionary moments in the history of the European avant-garde in order to both illuminate their relevance for us and to confront us with our nostalgia about them. Now, this kind of utopian strategy draws heavily on the legacy of the avant-garde, insofar as it attempts, as Jan Robertus put it, to intervene transhistorically in a historical moment in the hope that, quote, the ghost of history, if it would allow itself to be lured into making an appearance, might take on the shape of a revolution, unquote. The point of such strategies, in the absence of any realistic expectation of the ghost's appearance, is to provoke, is to show us the gap between the world we inhabit and its revolutionary possibility. Frederick Jameson argues that this sort of utopian strategy now better expresses our relation to a genuinely political future than any other program of action. He claims it forces us precisely to concentrate on the necessity of a radical break with the present, which is at the same time a meditation on its impossibility. Jameson identifies something many utopian artists share, which is the desire to model an alternative to the way things are in order to force some kind of engagement with them. Equally, in his utopian commitment to revolution, even if, as he admits, a revolution not yet fully imagined or understood, he identifies a powerful avant-gardist tendency to which many contemporary artists are drawn. A second cluster of utopian strategies, also derived from the legacy of the avant-garde, I would refer to as therapeutic utopianism. As the promise of revolution receded in the last century, the confidence of the modernist avant-gardes in the revolutionary potential of visual art gave way to postmodern pluralism, to a more localized, contingent, and open-ended strategies for linking art to political change. A central figure in this development, the development of these strategies, was of course Joseph Beuys, whose unbounded utopian ambition was to transform European societies by saturating them with art. As he put it, every human being is an artist who, from his state of freedom, the position of freedom he experiences at first hand, learns to determine the other positions of the total artwork of the future social order. Now, Beuys believed that art could redeem the future. He wanted everyone to be an artist because he believed that making art was free, was self-chosen creative activity, which could rescue human beings from the traumatizing and dehumanizing effects of individualism, instrumentalism, and competition. For Beuys, art was existentially therapeutic, and as such, should be distributed equally and be open and accessible to participation by as many people as possible. Now, however bonkers Beuys's utopian vision may now seem, there is a powerful idea at the core of it, which is that art is capable of healing the psychic damage done to people in societies conditioned by capitalist relations of production. Making art and engaging with art are at root creative, active forms of conscious life, which the transformation of one's present condition into something, in which the transformation of one's present condition into something shaped by one's own agency always remains an implicit possibility. For Beuys and many committed to this sort of utopian strategy, art is a form of self-created labor, what Marx identifies as key to the realization of our species being. And this is why therapeutic utopian strategies tend to be highly participatory. If art is to change us, it needs to be open to as many people as possible. I think many contemporary artists echo Beuys's therapeutic utopianism. A lot of this work, if not all, underlies the participatory turn in contemporary art over the past 20 years. Many artists want to engage their audiences in a more active participatory way, such that their experience of art is different from the passive consumption that characterizes their interactions with most other forms of life. So Ilya Kabakov's, sorry, my thing is somehow finished here. So for Beuys and many committed to this form of utopian strategy, art is a form of self-creative labor, which Marx identifies as key to the realization of our species being. And many contemporary artists, I think, echo this therapeutic utopianism. A lot of this work underlies the participatory turn in contemporary art over the past 20 years. Many artists want to engage their audiences in a more active participatory way, such that their experience of art is different from the passive consumption that characterizes their interactions with most other forms of life. Ilya Kabakov's wonderful work, The Palace of Projects, celebrates the human potential to construct and execute projects. Like Boyce, Kavakov believes art can find its way into the most mundane human activities, and also that it does so as an agent of liberation, a means of taking every individual beyond the quotidian towards something essentially human. Anthony Gormley has also developed a kind of therapeutic utopian strategy in his large-scale participatory works like Field and Domain Field. For Asian Field, each participant is given a very simple set of instructions to create small anthropomorphic forms. These then become a mass of similar, yet weirdly individuated forms, a field of identical, yet individually different bodies. The process models a kind of social contract between the artist and his collaborators in which everyone is empowered as a creator of the work. More recently, the work of a number of artists associated with the term relational aesthetics has developed the therapeutic ideal of participation even further. So Liam Gillick's constructions model the utopian possibilities of democratic life, while Tino Segal's work engaged their audiences in conversations about the future or dancing. Utopian moments of non-instrumental intersubjectivity occasioned by an artwork. In all these projects, participation in an artwork is proffered as a utopian moment in which a different kind of human experience is modeled, creative, non-instrumental, and equal. Therapeutic utopian strategies typically lack the direct political focus of critical utopian strategies and have been criticized by Buchloh and Claire Bishop, among others, as essentially compensatory, a way of diverting the art public from its responsibility to confront its own immersion in the maintenance of capitalist economic and social formations. Well, I disagree with this line of criticism because I think these therapeutic utopian strategies, while of course unequal in quality and force, do model the transformative potential of art and other forms of human activity that involve creativity, self-reflection, and non-instrumental relations with others. Even when they are not ostensibly about political or social issues, they embody the utopian impulse in ways that can invite critical reflection on the possibilities open to us. They are expressions of utopian hope. In Adorno's words, they point to the practice from which they abstain, creation of the just life. Okay, so I want, in the time remaining to me, to say a little bit about how I view the utopian impulse in education. I mean by this primarily higher education in the creative arts and humanities, but I hope what I have to say encompasses most of what we teach here at Goldsmiths as well as the pure sciences. My contention is that we need to recover a sense of the utopian possibility that informs teaching and research in schools and universities in order to, if not exactly rescue education from the economic growth model currently dominating educational policy, but at least to put up some sort of principled resistance to it. I'm using Martha Nussbaum's term, the economic growth model of universities, to refer to the view of universities championed by our current government. The basic idea underlying this notion is that the public funds necessary to sustain an advanced university system are only justified if that system promotes and sustains economic growth. There are two related parts to this model in the UK. First, universities have been transformed from self-governing institutions devoted to teaching and research into fee-funded educational service providers subject to a range of accountability regimes, including consumer protection law, the Office of Students, the REF, and the TEF. Second, government has clearly stated its preference and funding bias for research and teaching in subjects it believes will promote economic growth, and has backed this up by providing more support for STEM subjects and rating research very significantly in terms of economic, but now also social impact. So we all know this story. Over the past 20 years, the burden of payment for universities has shifted from the general tax base to a user pay system which has seen student fees treble. This affected a substantial transformation in how students are understood and treated by universities. Prior to the final fee change in 2012, students were largely treated as scholars, subsidized on the basis of ability and need by the state to pursue a field of study. Since 2012, students are increasingly treated as consumers who have selected an educational service provider and who have rights as consumers to a range of quite specific educational services. Now, universities accepted the fee increases in order to sustain their revenues and in many cases ensure their survival. And so they have found it difficult to resist the logic that has turned them into educational service providers. As an organization, an educational service provider tends to define itself more instrumentally in terms of the services others wish to purchase from it than a traditional university, which, until fairly recent anyway, and still are committed to an ethical idea of education. But anyway, more on this in a moment. The education for growth model privileges subjects other than the arts and social sciences because, as Nussbaum points out, the arts and social sciences promote critical thinking about values generally, including the value of economic growth. So educators for economic growth have little need of history courses that discuss the injustices of class, ethnicity, caste, or gender, because this encourages critical thinking about the failure of economic growth to mitigate such problems. She goes further to argue that the economic growth model is ultimately hostile to the arts because it requires, the economic growth model requires a certain level of moral obtuseness in order to sustain itself in the face of the inequalities capitalist economic growth creates. Arts education encourages people to develop a sympathetic understanding of others' viewpoints, and so makes it more difficult for them to treat others as instruments to be manipulated. Nussbaum writes, art is the great enemy of that obtuseness, and artists are not reliable servants of any ideology, even a basically good one. They always ask the imagination to move beyond its usual confines, to see the world in new ways. Thus, the arts and humanities and social sciences are expendable in a university system defined by its contribution to economic growth. Now, one common objection to this kind of argument is that while it is true that the past three governments in the UK, and probably before that, have embraced the economic growth service provider model, the successive accountability regimes they've introduced to affect their goals really just nibble at the edges of the core academic mission of universities. Now, this may be a serious point, but it is seldom comprehensively defended these days. Rather, the economic growth model is presented as the new ineluctable reality. It is a measure of the growth model's success that objections to it in professional company are typically dismissed as platitudinous and time-wasting, utopian in the pejorative sense. One often hears the truism, well, we are where we are, muttered, and then someone cites the catastrophic revenue costs of ignoring the latest government scheme for measuring the impact of research, student employability, or consumer satisfaction. The conversation then inevitably moves on to the most effective modes of compliance. Now, I know this pragmatism because I participated in it all the time. And I tell myself that I do so in order to defend the core values of the university and our particular model of education. But I do fear we are sleepwalking into an abyss of stupefying banality in which the challenges and rewards of genuine university education are in danger of being lost. And I'm trying to think about what these core values are and how one might articulate them, particularly in terms of my interest in utopia. I decided to read an essay written in 1958 by a British philosopher called Michael Oakeshott. The essay is called The Study of Politics in the University, an essay of appropriateness. Now, Oakeshott offers what is in many respects an antiquated idea of university education. But from our standpoint, I think its otherness offers a useful diagnostic reminder of what we are sleepwalking away from. Oakeshott defines education as, quote, the process of learning in circumstances of direction and constraint, how to recognize and make something of ourselves. The process of learning in circumstances of direction and constraint, how to recognize and make something of ourselves. He thinks this process always occurs against the background of a civilization, by which he means an intellectual and a cultural tradition, a range of beliefs, images, ideas, manners of thinking, languages, skills, practices, and manners of activity into which we are initiated by our education. He also states that we can think of a civilization as a conversation, quote, being carried on between a variety of human activities, each speaking a language of its own. He cites activities such as moral and practical endeavor, religious faith, philosophic reflection, artistic contemplation, and historical or scientific inquiry and explanation. He says that relations between these activities are conversational. They are not relations of assertion and denial, but they are conversational relationships of acknowledgement and accommodation. Now, Oakeshott believed university education was primarily about being inducted into and participating in these conversations. In light of this, he distinguished sharply between the character, though not the value, of vocational education and university education. Vocational education, he says, is primarily about the acquisition of a skill set that consists of a specific body of knowledge, which might be quite simple or extremely complicated. The goal of acquiring such knowledge is to be able to use it to function effectively within a certain activity, like plumbing or financial derivatives or jet engine maintenance. The body of knowledge is typically circumscribed and does not look beyond itself, and in this respect is more like a literature or a text than it is like a language. As Oakeshott puts it, quote, what has been acquired is a knowledge of what has been authoritatively said, and not a familiarity with the manner of thinking which has generated what has been said. University education, on the other hand, in contrast, is concerned with learning languages rather than literatures or text, explanatory modes of thinking rather than prescriptive bodies of knowledge that enable one to exercise specific skills. The acquisition of this language occurs within a conversational context, in which different explanatory modes of thought engage conversationally with each other, disrupt and challenge themselves, consider their authoritative conclusions, and push back the boundaries of their explanatory power. So what universities offer is not information, not a highly developed skill set, but rather some understanding of what it is to think historically, mathematically, scientifically, or philosophically. Some understanding of these disciplines as explanatory enterprises. And very little of this, in Oakeshott's view, has direct practical relevance to contemporary life. And therefore, he writes in 1958, quote, in a society such as ours, which has a high standard of practical relevance, universities have often to be defended. Now, Oakeshott's account of university education was written at a time when about 4% of school leavers went to university. Most of them men, most of them from private schools, privately educated, and most of them with a much clearer idea about what constituted the cultural capital of British European civilization than students now. The context in which he wrote cannot be recovered. So how does harking back to the good old days of free higher education for privileged white people help us in the current moment? I would argue that it helps us diagnostically, in the sense that it reminds us of what makes university education such a valuable thing. A thing for which people willingly accumulate vast debts, work at various jobs, and endure considerable stress to achieve. Oakeshott insists that unique character of a university education consists in the possibility of giving form to who we are through the study of an academic subject, and that any attempt to instrumentalize this activity is to change it into something else. My view is that something very like this utopian conception of university education is embodied in art education at Goldsmiths, and indeed in most of the disciplines we teach. To study art at Goldsmiths is to be inducted into a community devoted to making, discussing, writing about, evaluating, and understanding the significance of art. It demands that students make work and then engage in a series of conversations about that work over a period of years. These conversations usually begin with the student's work, but they draw it outward into an engagement with the work of others, with theories about and ways of understanding art, its relation to society, culture, identity, and so on. And all this is directed at helping students develop a mode of making art that has significance primarily for themselves, a practice that is their own. Teaching art in this context is therefore not primarily about imparting skills, unless these have to do with the development of an individual's particular approach to making art. It is rather about opening students to their potential and providing them with the kinds of conversations, in the Oakeshottian sense, that they need to discover and realize that potential. Teaching like this, university teaching, addresses the utopian moment of the not yet, the moments throughout our lives, but particularly when we are young, in which we actively seek to give determinate form to our latent talents and abilities, whether or not we actually know what these are. We need to nurture and protect such teaching in the social sciences, humanities, and the arts, because it helps our students and us to find determinate form for our potential. And in doing so enables us to lead more complex, more interesting, ethically richer lives. It is, in other words, what makes universities worthwhile. Now, can a utopian defense of university education stand up to the iron utilitarian logic of the economic growth model of universities? I have my doubts on many days, I must say, but perhaps stranger things have happened. At Goldsmiths, we are still fighting our corner. We comply with the various accountability regimes, but we also produce a huge amount of amazing research and creativity and teaching that is impossible to define in terms of its contribution to economic growth. And we have our own utopian project, if I may say, in the Goldsmiths Center for Contemporary Art. It's a huge credit to SMT and to the University Council that they were utopian enough to allow the GCCA to be built more or less solely on the promise that it would make Goldsmiths a more interesting place to work and study. So I see the GCCA as a way of resisting the growth logic. But at the same time, I think we need to remind ourselves of and continue to debate and defend in public the utopian values that make university education worth pursuing. Thanks very much. Okay. Anyway, thank you all very much for coming. I really appreciate it. It's a great honor to be here. I'm delighted to see you all. And let's now have a drink. Okay, well,
Sorry? Yeah. Possibilities, that's all.